Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they did. They absolutely got it right. And today we're going to do some interesting concept stuff, but I want to build into it for you a little bit. We've had some terrible losses here in Ohio. And before I get started into what those terrible losses were, they're not relative to the tornadoes and all the storms that we had. They're even worse than that. And just to start off with, this is, if you don't remember, Tom Navolis, your host. And I want to take and ask you to definitely go to samueladamsreturns.net and sign up for the newsletter. I mean, we really sure can use more folks participating in the newsletter to help get the word out and to take a look at the two books here on the bookshelf behind me that I've written, because people buying the books or inviting Sam Adams to speak or inviting myself to come and do the seminar on the big book out there, From Covenant to the Present Constitution. That's kind of how we fund what we do. We don't really have other means or mechanisms or try to sell you a whole lot of stuff. But I figured, you know what? Everybody else does a lot of self-promoting, so I guess I need to as well. Um, but with that, it pains me. It just terribly pains me that we have had a major loss on Tuesday in Ohio. That loss is our children. That loss is happening in a number, about I think 30 other states in this union. That loss has taken and is just we're going to be talking about Tolkien and C.S. Lewis a little bit later, but that loss that we experience are those spiders in Tolkien that has come and wrapped every aspect of an evil web around the education system in Ohio. It's been bad enough over the last 80 years that education has been chomped away at, has been bit, poisoned, spewed, stewed, everything else that we can even think of. But here in Ohio, the nail that has been put pretty much all the way into the coffin, if you will, as the old adage goes, is that of social emotional learning. You have heard me speak of that in other programs. We've had Adam Reddick on a couple times to take you through what the depth of that is. Now, I believe that the primary market that this program is there in Maryland, as well as the extended markets, and obviously here in Ohio. Social emotional learning has just, it's put those viper's fangs into the legs of every parent. It's evil, okay? You can go to the website, you can go look at the last programs. I'm not going to belabor it, but the vote happened this past Tuesday, even with the letters and not enough parent participation, okay? That's it. Parents are dumb, dumb, dumb. And the ones that are even dumber or dumbest are those church leaders. Not all, because we have some really good church leaders here in Ohio, but they're few, very, very few. And we have not seen, and I'm not just talking about the pulpits. When I talk about church leaders, I'm talking about either those that are on the corporate boards or those that call themselves elders or those that call themselves deacons, whomever they may be, and the major denominations that take and have capitulated to tolerance have just taken and now moved the children of Ohio into full moral government indoctrination, secretly also. And I mean that every child is now considered mentally ill. Every child, when it comes to social emotional learning, is considered mentally ill. And they will be doing, without any parental permission, they will be doing an analysis on your child. And that data is going to go into the great Google Microsoft database. That's why they get Chromebooks in all the different school districts, is so that their data is captured, because the intent is to take and put into place now, without question, is what's being put into place is to follow that child from right out of and in preschool all the way through university, and profile them continuously as to whether they have the right attitudes, whether they have the right mental characters, whether they have the right behavioral traits, and how should then the mental health and drug institutions that are at every county level get your funding to take and retrain those children. And what does it mean for good behavior? What does it mean to have government established morality? What does it mean to be tolerant? What does it even mean to understand what your gender is? And you don't have to have any gender. You can choose as you mature based on your behavioral attitudes, based on what the moral decisions are within the context of the government and the school district, how they implement social emotional learning in your various school districts. Ohio, I hope there are some parents, and in Maryland, go check. And I guarantee you that social emotional learning is there, because you guys are as left as Oregon, Washington, and California, which has it. Because I checked for with people in Washington that I know, and social emotional learning is being pressed in Washington State as well. So it's a pervasive evil. Okay. So how do we take and look at, and you on the video can see the way that I'm putting my hands, that all-seeing eye that was there inside of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, that evil, how do we deal with that evil? I don't know. At this point, the letter writing pretty much is over. Quite frankly, the only thing that I think any parent can do, and I don't know that the major churches have the guts, the intestinal fortitude, the will of Scripture to fight against these institutions that they've allowed to happen over the last 80 years, because they didn't stand up and fight, especially since the 60s, when the Ten Commandments were taken out of the schools. So yes, this first segment is hammering home on every church person that listens to me. Any person other than those that I know, like Dr. Spalding and a few others that are right there and battling and understanding the whole conflict, greater war that we're a part of, and our greater responsibility as believers to engage fully in that which we already have been given to engage in. Now, I think what it's going to take is that some parents are going to have to see how detrimental this is to their children and believe it. Go study it for themselves, research it for themselves, that their kids aren't theirs anymore at all. The school districts and the government own now 100% of your children's minds, spirits, and bodies based on implementing social emotional learning. Well, I think I probably jumped on that enough. Maybe it is going to take what I think ultimately is going to be parents that have some kahunas and are going to go out there and start suing the school districts and suing the mental health boards and suing the state for taking and violating your First Amendment rights as parents to raise your children according to your belief system, your morality, and not that of any public institution or greater God that sits down in the case here in Columbus, Ohio, or wherever your state capital is. They're not the God. They're not the gods. They think they are. But you know what, ladies and gentlemen? That's up to you. I can't help you with that anymore. We've already done as much as we can. So you have to fight. You have to learn how to fight. So, what's the rest of the segment's going to be about today? I just had to get that off my chest. Well, I'm going to, or as I did in the promo, I'm calling this Lewis Tolkien and the Anti-federalist. How does that all fit? You know, I gave you a little idea of it when I started to take and put together from Tolkien and Lewis's relationship and how they were all part of the Inklings and how they would read one another's manuscripts and where the you started looking at what Lewis wrote, especially in the Narnia series, and how that's an allegory, could be a true allegory. And there's, people way smarter than me that look at Tolkien and Lewis and all the different writings. And you know what? I'm not a literature, person. I'm not an expert in all of that, but I've read all those series, both of Lewis and all of Lewis's books and all of Tolkien's books numerous times. And I understand them as a reader, not just from the enjoyment, but what does it mean in their words from all of that that drives back to the glorious governance of the King of Kings, as well as what does it mean in local governance, and how does that fit when a nation comes to fruition? So I started thinking about all of what Lewis and Tolkien wrote, and then I started looking and going, you know what, as I've said before in this program, there are no new words, okay, except for the language that globalist, communist, whatever he is, Soros and his father's mentor created on a new language. But the words that we use in our language, you know what? Before Lewis and Tolkien were using those words and even those Reformation concepts and principles and thought processes, the Anti-federalists were using them first. And that's what I want to talk to you about today is the principles that transcend what happened not only in Narnia and the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, but some of those aspects of what are those common principles in governance, in tyranny, in disaster, in the taking and trying to own another person and taking and moving them through a process of enlightenment and recognition of truth. Anti-federalists did that too. And they did it in so many different ways in their writings. And it's almost like if you take and you segment the Anti-federalist papers and their predictiveness, we can see some of what's happened for our present time. Because I say this program is all about the mirrors of history. And then when we're looking into those mirrors of history, what we're actually seeing is that transcending word of all of eternity as the breath of Aslan and creating all of Narnia come to fruition. And then we see all that happened from the elves to the last king in Tolkien. My, we're going to have a really interesting conversation in these next two segments. And Sam Adams, the Anti-federalist, you know what? He's returned, and those Anti-federalists, as we know, over and over, they absolutely got it right. And looking forward to seeing you in the next segment. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second segment of Samuel Adams Returns Those Anti-Federalists. They did get it right. And this is Tom Novulis, your host. And, as always, I'm so delighted that you're back here with me. And more importantly, that those that are listening on the radio with Liberty Works Radio Network, where liberty does work for you. And for those that are also listening on Saturdays out of Lima, Ohio, I'm so delighted to be here at the invite of Pastor Mike. So, with that, this is, again, Tom Novulis, your host. And as I mentioned in the first segment, please go to SamuelAdamsReturns.net, sign up for the newsletter, take a look at the books, invite Sam Adams to come and speak. He'll do that. He's got some things that we can do, especially in the Ohio market. And the seminars, they go with book number 2 that's up there. So take a look at that, and please participate with us, and we'll try and get you more information. And also, very much also, go and start looking at those videos of the chaplains and clergy of the Revolution. Boy, they got it. They established it for this nation. They are the unsung heroes, which, unlike today, there's a few out there, but not many. Not many that are in the pulpits. And that's what we need. We need the restoration of our pulpits. So keep praying for that, and we'll see what happens. God knows what's going to go on, and that's the critical piece. So where do I want to go with that whole sow thing that I mentioned a few weeks ago? I like to sow a lot. Well, here's what we're going to start with. We're going to talk and try and drag through. And again, I'm not a literary expert, so to bring you through all the nuances of Lewis and Tolkien, I am an anti-federalist expert. That's where I'm at. I'm a federalist expert. I'm a constitutional expert. I'm looking at as, we look behind me again, the Founders Constitution on those volumes that are behind me, and going through that level of detail of what does it mean to bring together principles of truth. And really, that's what Tolkien and Lewis were doing in so much of their different way. Lewis more purposefully, I think Tolkien wanting to be, from a literary perspective, something new and different, and in the type of writing that he did. But at the same time, there are eternal principles of truth that one draws from in each of those different discussions. There was something here. Let me see if I can find it real quick, because I had something else queued up that I wanted to start with. And as I was looking at it, oh no, what did I do? I moved it around. Sorry, I apologize for that. I was going through so many things trying to get us ready for the program that I read so far so fast that I moved it along. But there was in what was being spoken of and what happened during those different conversations and manuscript readings during the Inklings, there was something that I'm stumbling, and I apologize because I ended up moving it, was that as Bilbo was taken and walking into that the seeing the dragon lair and seeing everything that was in there, he had an impossible time putting words to the magnificence of all that was in the dragon lair. And in reference to that, I can't find the exact quote. I'll have to do that for you in the third segment, so I apologize. It was how do you capture the words? What is it that the words are? And I just found it. So thank you for me kind of fumbling along with that. So the reference in question that was coming up here is that when Bilbo walked into Smaug's treasure hoard within the Lonely Mountain, the quote is, "To say that Bilbo's breath was taken away is no description at all. There are no words left to express his staggerment. Since men changed the language that they learned of the elves in the days when all was wonderful, Bilbo had heard tell and sing of dragon hordes before, but the splendor, the lust, the glory of such treasure had never yet come home to him. His heart was filled and pierced with enchantment." What I wanted to kind of drive home in this segment was that idea right there is the changing of the language of men. And what we continuously hear in the political debates right now in America, globally, if you will, is this whole thing of who owns the narrative? Who owns the narrative? What are the words? What is that which is taken and manipulated from its original concept, from its original intent, from that which would allow people to have that clear idea? In the case of this particular statement, is since men changed the language that they learned of the elves in the days when all was wonderful. Now we can take that and we can see that from the time of creation, the time that God breathed into Adam, the time that, from the Lewis allegory, that it was the lion, Aslan, taking and breathing into all of creation of Narnia, that there was a language. And what was unique in the Narnian language was the whole idea that animals spoke. Those observers of that creation, the young boy, the young girl, and the crazy professor, and definitely the witch, the evil one, they all were there and saw the animals that could gather, and that which gathered around Aslan and understood those truths, those words. So too for us, when you take and especially you read the Bible, you see that God breathed, he spoke, he interacted, but then the deceiver, that evil witch, came in and was taking and manipulating language. And we've seen language manipulation throughout of history and time. We have seen the evils of men. Kathy and I were watching this past week, earlier in the week, on Assyria. A great, guy put together a nice YouTube video on some history on Assyria and Babylon, and just how constantly the greed, the lust of treasure, and the hordes of not just being a dragon horde, if you will, but let's look at the hordes of the armies, those overwhelming forces that would grow up in the eyes of the lust of what was out there in another nation, the power, the idea to consume everything and gather all of that into one's lair. It still goes on today. What do you think George Soros is all about? The globalism that goes back to his father and his father's mentor, and the language that they began was to gather the world into one thing, his open society. What does that have to do with anything that Tolkien may have written? Well, we see the same concept, if you will. When we look at the world before Middle Earth, and we see where the elves were and what happened and the gloriousness of that westward island. And then as people, the elves took and transitioned and ended up moving in the creation of Middle Earth, Follow the story of Tolkien as well. And we see that they did. They had this wonderful language. And then as men were created into Middle Earth and every other entity that was there, we saw that dispersion of what was good, what was evil. And how was the language taken? What happened in the changing of the words? What happened in the meaning, the narrative? Hmm. Let's go a little bit. We're going to keep going back and forth to some degree here as I cue other things up. But I wanted you to hear this as we're down to the last, 4 minutes? Yeah, so the last 4 minutes. Here's something. Those who are full of faith suppose that the words in pursuance thereof, and that's in quotation marks, are restrictive. But if they reflect a moment and to take into consideration the comprehensive expressions of the instrument, they will find that their restrictive construction is unavailing. And this is evident by the first article, 8th section, talking about the Constitution of 87, where this government has a power, quote, to lay and collect all taxes, duties, imposts, and excise, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, end quote. And also, quote, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or office thereof, end quote. Now, just that statement alone was very interesting as an expression of first article, 8th section of the Constitution. What does that mean? What happened? Where is that expanded narrative today? The writer of this Anti-federalist paper kind of continues, and he says, to conclude my observations on this head, it appears to me as impossible that these powers in the state constitution and those in the general government can exist and operate together, as it would be for a man to serve two masters, kind of a biblical concept, whose interests clash, and secure the approbation of both. Can there be at the same time and place be and operate two supreme legislatures, executives, and judicials? Will a guarantee of a republican form of government to every state in the Union, which was quoted, be of any avail, or secure the establishment and retention of state rights? Now, we're going to have to get into this a little bit more in the third segment. But when we see that governments were set up, first off, by biblical creation, by God, and He being the ultimate head of the whole universe, and then we see the allegory of all of that within Lewis's writings in the whole series of Narnia, and how that explains, and how we see Aslan come into different time segments for different purposes within that whole storyline. Interesting. We see the different governments and all of that. And then when we see what happened during Tolkien's whole series of who was the king, how was it disposed, what happened between the elves, the dwarves, the humans, and the evil ones, becomes very interesting. And then when we see the battle to take and come up away from a tyrannical Great Britain, England, for the liberties of those in America, the colonies that then became states, and those states as sovereign, independent republics, what happens when they come under this generalized constitution? And what do the words mean? And how do they come together? So that's what we're going to come back with when Sam Adams, as he's returned, and yes, once again, we can say with confidence, those anti-federalists, they absolutely got it right. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to this third and last segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists got it right. And today, there's several concepts that we've been talking about. And at the beginning of the first segment, or I should say, just about the whole time of the first segment, what I discussed was the destruction, the final destruction of our children in what's happening, especially in Ohio and a number of the other states with social emotional learning. I can't let that one go, and I'm not going to spend this whole segment on that because I think we have some things to finish up with in discussing my kind of dance into the comparison of C.S. Lewis's writings with Tolkien and the Anti-federalists, and drawing that from that whole perspective of what happens in language, what is the narrative, what happens with words, how does that change? And really, the four have that significant tie point. And that tie point being is how is language used? What are those words? So I'm going to jump back on that just for a second because I think that there is something interesting that you need to hear and understand is that when we looked at what happened on Tuesday with social emotional learning, the destruction of the family or the destruction of the children for the future is something that we can see as a continuous work of the evil one, of the devil, of Satan, who, so many people, and this is where a lot of Christians have vacated the society because, they have their scriptures, in my opinion, from a Reformation, Puritan perspective, is that the world was ceded to Satan for a period of time, but I guess I go with the Puritan, Augustinian perspective that when Jesus died, rose, and became the conqueror and ascended, the whole earth was now once again put under his what? Under his feet, under his footstool. And to me, what that means is in every respect, with death being defeated, so too is the ultimate reign of Satan. He still is a playground. He still is in here making an effect, or whether he, it, or what, the devil has this effect here on earth. But at the same time, the risen Christ, the ascended Christ, is the winner. Now, where do we see that? We see that in an allegory there in the first C.S. Lewis book of Narnia, Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. But where do we see some of that defeat and look for the hope of how we win is in education. Education right now. We can even look at what had happened in Tolkien in the education of the old stories. And once again, Tolkien never liked the allegorical tie points, historical tie points, and all of that within his stories. But one cannot read it ultimately, especially if you've read it over and over like I have over the years, is that the moral significance that is in there and the principles that are in there that one has to look at from a whole leadership interaction, societal interaction, cross-societal interaction, and even some of the dumbing down within Bree education and the children not knowing, except for the simple stories, the larger world. Well, here we go. We can just tie it all together. So there is a couple good articles that are in the references that you should take a look at. And the one that I just want to comment on here real quick is from a commentary that says K-12 education has become progressive Sunday school. So when we think about something being allegorical, the particular writer here is that talking about as an adolescent being just being my education as a Catholic I had catechism classes and goes through and talks about that relative to this person's Roman Catholic faith. And the same is true in the context of Protestants, in that the majority of the different denominations have their, you know, catechism, have their Sunday schools. Same difference. Well, this person in this writing goes through to talk about that now in schools, the teachers are such chasing the next progressive idea, which SEL is total progressivism, I'll say communism, to the extent that, yeah, it is religion. When kids are going to school, and that, especially now when it comes to what it means to be a boy, what it means to be a girl, or what it means to be neither or both, and then how do you act? What do you tolerate? Do you fight? Do you take and, interact from our fallen human nature without a moral direction that the Ten Commandments used to give in the schools? It's all progressivism. It's churchism. It's taking and teaching the new religion, the progressive religion. And this has been going on, as we know, for the last 80 years, but mostly since the 60s. So go ahead and look at that. I mean, it's a very extensive article. And one of the things that was very interesting to me that is in there as well is this whole chart of Democratic versus Republican in occupations, and where the progressives are more than the other. So what occupations are children that are now marked by SEL and all this progressive educational system, where are they directed? I kind of go into the book of the Two Towers with that one, where what we have is we see Saruman in the White Tower now tearing down all of the trees to fall under the will of the Black Tower and Sauron. And to the extent that now what is being molded out of that clay, if you will, and again, I know Tolkien would be upset with me using allegory or anything like that there, but when I think of the new educational system, I said that under SEL there would be minions. Well, under the new SEL system, what is being created are the orcs with the white hand of Saruman placed on their foreheads and helmets. That's what we're going to have. And they're going to be divided then into the education movement to that job, that place that the likes of the Koch brothers want them to go into, that likes and design of where they will fit into society, because they will be followed and monitored on their Chromebooks. Does it sound nefarious? Does it sound like tinfoil hat stuff? Maybe, to some. But the fact and reality is, it is happening under SEL. Now, let's get back to our anti-federalist friends for a moment and kind of figure out where we at. 9 minutes, 6 minutes. Oh my goodness, we have to move quickly. So what they're really talking about here, and I could just go on and on from what is justice, what is the judicial aspect of things, where does that all fit from what the anti-federalists were taking and bringing together, and morality. And we know that both Madison and John Adams said that the Constitution of 87, and this is where we have to look at the context, the narrative, how the words transcend, and those other pictures of what you've seen in how Saruman would take and manipulate the words, how all through the Narnia series you would hear words manipulated. What about with the prince's chair, prince being all tied up in the chair, and he would hear the words of that witch? And how did he react within all those things that he went out and did and what he thought he was and how he was owned and captivated and captured. No different. That happens all through time. So I continuously say that none of the words that we hear spoken today have not been spoken before. It is how they're constructed, how they're used. Will they be used in truth and in principle, or, as we say nowadays, it's the narrative? And how is the narrative out there? Well, it's always interesting, even that. It's like, hey, are you going to say what you're going to say? Spit it out. And now it has to be, oh, it's all about the narrative. Well, here's the narrative back in the day of our founding fathers, and when we were talking about even the judicial powers, the supreme law of the land, how that would be manipulated, how we just looked at in the last segment that whole idea of what would be that simple clause of saying here, yes, what shall be necessary and proper, and how we've seen that perverted. I talk about it in From Covenant to the Present Constitution, and how it is even more perverted. Language matters, definitions matter, and that's exactly what the Anti-federalist is trying to say. What do those words mean? Because right now what we see is in the provisions of that language, based on the difference between the Hamiltonian even and the Madison definition in comparison and extended, questioned by the Anti-federalist, we see the perversion in the Constitution almost from its beginning. Right? That's why the amendments were absolutely necessary. So in this language, in our modern times, we see what is going on in the narrative by none other than the Democrats and many of the Republicans who do not understand those created words, who do not understand the original intent. So no different than understanding that original intent, according to Aslan, breathing Narnia into existence and taking it all the way to the last battle. It becomes interesting. What were and are the meanings? No different than seeing in the earlier books by Tolkien and what happened with the creation, if you will, of the elves and all the way through Middle Earth and all of the different battles of good and evil. What happened? How does that work? And no different within our constitutional republic is that every state is its own republic, but we've lost that, as the Anti-federalists predicted would happen, is that based on not understanding and following the moral principles and virtues that the pulpits were supposed to continue to instantiate into students, into our society, we've turned society and our students over to evil so that they no longer understand that original intent. And again, as I just started to mention, is that the Anti-federalists predicted that the federal government would become the all-consuming environment. When, ladies and gentlemen, Sam Adams always said that all government is local. That is the idea and truth of what a republic is all about, and every state being its own republic. But with all the media and everything that we have, it becomes all-consuming. So what I'd like you to do is go ahead to samueladamsreturns.net, sign up, make sure that you check out the books and all of the archive programs. Definitely get your pastors and your church leaders to understand the chaplains and the clergy of the revolution. And they need to go back and understand what that means to be engaged fully in society. Let's take back our educational system to start with. It's up to you, parents. And Sam Adams, he continues to take and hammer it home. Those anti-federalists, they were absolutely so predictive that we're going to ask you to come on back next week and enjoy a very interesting guest.